Hey everyone and welcome back to another video. This is my first video after having a baby. Yeah, I'm hoping he's asleep. Anyways, in this video you're gonna learn 5 things about Tailwind version 3 that you will use for increasing your productivity and how you build web applications with Tailwind. Now watch till the end because these tips and tricks are amazing, and if you have not subscribed to the channel, do it right now and like the video in the end if you find this useful. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing that you need to do is to clone this repository, and you can find the URL in the description. Then you need to just go here, click this button, copy the URL, and then open your terminal so you can clone it. To clone it, you need to type git clone and then you paste the URL itself. Once you're done with that, you need to open this into your favorite editor. For this video, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code, and I already have this open in my editor. We are also going to use an extension called the live server so we don't have to switch windows and we can see the preview right here in this VS Code window. Then you need to make sure that you are on the start here branch, and you do that by opening a terminal and then making sure that you are in the folder itself, and then you need to do git checkout and then start dash here. Once you do so, you hit enter and you can see that now in the index HTML, we only have this text, which is Tailwind CSS v3 changes. Now to enable or to open the live server, all you need to do is to press Ctrl+Shift+P and then type live preview. And you can see that we have this internal browser here. If you're on Mac, that would be Command+Shift+P. And you click this and you can see that we have the changes right here. So let's talk about the first thing, that is called Play CDN. And that is a way now for us to use Tailwind CSS 3 without even having to install it via packages like npm or yarn, because we can use a simple script tag in our index.html to just include that. Note that this is not intended for production, which means that you should not be shipping your Tailwind CSS in production just like this, because this is called Play CDN, which is intended for playground or just really quick demos that you want to do without having to use, let's say, a package manager. So let's try it out and see how this looks. So all you need to do here is just include a script tag that is pointing to cdn.tailwindcss.com, and you can see that this is a script tag having a source attribute. Now you might be thinking, hey Ahsan, this is a CSS library or Tailwind CSS. Why do I have to include a JavaScript here? And that is essentially how they have managed to work it out. They essentially inject a script which essentially looks into the classes and generates the styles accordingly for the playground. And this is why perhaps it's not a really good idea to use that in production. Now you can see that as soon as I remove this, the styles on the right side in the preview change completely. As soon as I add it, you can see that we get this BG gray or background gray on the page. We also have some styles of fonts changes as well. But now even I can essentially create a div here, and let's say I can call this a container. So I can say class container and I can say something like BG or red and something like 800. And here I can paste my text and you can see that now we got it here. We can also add some more classes like text white, and then we can add something like padding of 4, and similarly we can have something like border or essentially rounded, and we can also add some sort of margin so it looks something like this. Now you can see that we can easily add CSS to our page using the Play CDN. Now let's talk about the second thing, colored box shadows. This is something that the community has been asking for quite a long time, and the Tailwind team has managed to provide this to us in a very effective way after a couple of iterations on how they build it. So in general, we are now able to use colored box shadows. Let's try that. So we are going to begin with creating a container, and here we are also give this a pi or py of 4, and then we are going to create another container just to make sure that we have all the styles right here. So we can start with, let's say, having an h2 which would have a class of text, or not text but essentially my4, and then inside here we can say something like colored box shadows. Okay, now you can see that we have this right here which has a margin y of 4. Now what we need to do is we need to have the text centered, so we can say text center, and also we can use a class for having a larger text, something like text XL, and you can see that now we have a larger text. If I remove it, it's different. If I add it, it's different. Now let's talk about the box shadows itself. So we're essentially going to create a div with flex, and here we are also going to give this a p of 10, which means we are giving this a padding of 10. Then we are going to say BG is going to be white, so we can add a white background to this, and then we are going to add a couple of elements right here. You can see that now we see the background as well. Here we are also going to say justify content to be center or justify center. So we have this at the center, or any elements that we create, they're essentially going to be centered. Now we are going to create some elements. We are going to create some buttons essentially. So we are essentially going to create BG wide, and then essentially we are going to say padding is going to be 4 for these ones. And then we can say rounded MD. And one last thing would be shadow. And then we can say shadow and then blue. And then we can say 400. And then essentially we are just going to say click me. So you can see here we get a really nice text here. So now that we have this, let's add a shadow to this. So we can simply say something like shadow SM, and you can see that now we got a shadow that is of the blue color, and the button itself here, it's white. So what I'm going to do is that I'm actually going to copy this and paste this a couple of times, actually 2 times, to show you something. This is the shadow MD and this is the shadow LG, which means that you can see that this is small shadow, medium shadow, and large shadow. And here we can also add something like a gap of 4. And here we can also add a gap of 4 so we can see these buttons better. Now you may think that they look cool, or you might think that they don't, but in either case, I'm actually going to show you another version of this. So in this one, we are going to have colored buttons and colored box shadows. So in this one, I'm actually going to make the shadow large for everyone. Then instead of BG white, we are going to use indigo 500. Similarly, I'm going to use blue color here, and then cyan or cyan as other people call it. So I'm going to use blue here, and then I'm going to use cyan here. And now I need to add the text white as well. So I'm going to say text white, and I can essentially use that here, here, and here. And finally, we are going to have the box shadow of the relevant colors. Right now, the box shadow for all of those are actually blue. So I'm going to just change that from blue to the relevant color. So I'm going to say this is going to be indigo and this is going to be cyan. And now you see that they look amazing. Now let's talk about the third thing, which is adding arbitrary properties to your HTML instead of using what Tailwind provides out of the box. And this means that we can give our custom values along with the Tailwind CSS classes. So let's try it out now. So we can essentially try it really easily by replacing something from Tailwind to essentially our own values. For example, here you can see that we have this BG Indigo, which is 500. So instead of this BG Indigo, I can actually give my own value. For instance, I could give something like hash 333, and you see that I can give a hard-coded value here, which is an arbitrary value, and I can provide it here and it works. For example, I could say green, and now it just uses the colors that I provide. You can also even do something like RGB 222 or 2324, and you see that everything works here out of the box. Similarly, apart from these colors as well, we can also give paddings. For instance, here, instead of P4, I could say something like 40 pixel, and you would see that this would essentially work once I type it correctly. So you can see that here we are giving values to us. Now this is very important because sometimes you might not want to use Tailwind provided styles or values and you have your own values, but you still want to use those classes for the structure and kind of consistency. So this is what you could do when you're working on it. And this is something that we are going to use further in the examples as well. So hold on. All right, so the fourth thing that we are going to discuss is the Snap API. And that essentially allows us to create really cool UI, such as a slider that you can use to slide different images. And Tailwind provides us now a really cool way with the Snap API and the Scroll API combined together to kind of achieve all of those things. So let's get into one of the real world examples that we can use right now. All right, so first of all, I see that this looks a bit weird because we have a lot of space right here, and that is because of the container class. So apart from this, we can say margin auto, and that would make sure that everything is centered now. All right, so for this Snap API, we are going to create another div just after this one. So essentially, I'm just going to go here and say this is going to be a BG wide, and then this is also going to have a PY4. So you see now that we have got this container. Inside this container, we are essentially going to have this. So we essentially have a flex class. Inside here, we have divs, and each div has an image. Now, if I want to make a slider out of this, what I want to do is each of these images would be able to scroll through it. So first of all, what I need to do is I need to say on this flex, we are going to say overflow X auto. And now we don't see any scroll. And that is because all of these images are essentially shrinked down to accommodate all of the space within this entire width. So what we can do here is that we can essentially add some class. So I'm actually going to do that in just a bit as soon as I select all of these. So here I can say something like class, and here we can essentially have something like flex, shrink, and then we can say 0. And you see that now we essentially got all of these, and now we can scroll them. Right now, one more thing that we need to do is we also need to tell where these are going to be snapped. But even before so, we need to add another class here. So we are going to call this snapX. Now, if I try to scroll, you see that nothing happens, but I'm going to just refresh this. If I scroll, you see nothing still happens because we need to specify on each element what kind of a snap are we targeting. Are we targeting the center of the snap, the left of the snap, or towards the right? So here we can say something like snap center. And if we do that, now see what happens. So now if I try to scroll and leave, you see it comes back. It comes back. But if I move a bit forward, you see that it's now essentially taking this image center. So this image has this center snapped. If I go beyond, you see that it still brings this image back to the center. If I move forward, you can see that now this image center is there. And at the beginning, obviously this image center cannot come here. So that's fine in the beginning. But as I move forward, each next image would essentially be snapped to the center unless the last one. Similarly, we can essentially change this snap center to snap start, and that would make sure that we have the snapping appearing at the start. So if I replace this with a snap start, let's see what happens. So now if I move, you see that this is snapping to the first one. If I move forward, you see that this image is now snapped to the beginning. If I move forward, the third image is going to be snapped to the beginning. And similarly, you can use the snap end towards snapping the end of the image. And remember that you can always specify the snap position for each of those images. I actually saw something really cool on the Tailwind CSS 3 where they are essentially sharing all of this information. And here the snap essentially had a really nice UI that I liked. For example, this is snap point. What if we wanted to build this snap point that would show that the images are being snapped at the center? That would be cool, right? And we are also going to give these images sort of a border and a shadow as well, just like this one. So we're gonna go to our snap API here, and then for each of the image, I'm essentially going to give some sort of style here. So let's say we add this one, and this one, and here we can say something like shadow MD. So each of these images would get a shadow. Then we also would have something like margin of 4. And you would see that we got the margin 4, but since this is a flex, we can essentially use a gap up top instead of the margin as well. And then here we can say something like rounded MD, and you would see that they would essentially get the rounded class, or actually just say rounded. And then towards each image, we can essentially add a class, and then for that class, we can specify that the image itself is a bit rounded. So let's quickly do that in just a bit. So we can say class, and then here we can say something like rounded MD, or essentially LG, and then we would see them. Now that we have this, we can simply say the gap is going to be 4 here, and now you see that we get these images. Now if I move forward and change the snap start to snap center, let's see what happens. So I'm gonna essentially change this, save this, and let's see what happens. So if I move this, the images are still being snapped to the center. Now let's actually draw something like what we just saw, which is this snap point, this line, and this text as well. Let's try it out. It's going to be a bit different for what my implementation would be because I was looking at the dark one, and this is what we are going to essentially go for. So let's begin with implementing this, and this is just a bonus that you can consider of how to work with Tailwind CSS live in action. So first of all, I'm going to create a div right inside this BG white, and here we are going to essentially give this a position of absolute. So we can say something like absolute here. Then we are going to essentially create one more thing inside. Let's say first we say something like snap point. Okay, so let's call it a snap point here. Now you can see it right here. The snap point is being shown here, but essentially this absolute would also require us to give a relative top, so we can specify what would be the position of the top and left for this absolute element. So here we can start with specifying the left to 0, the right to 0, and we can also specify the top to 0. And you can see that now it's kind of snapping, or not snapping, but kind of attaching itself to the top. And then we need to just say the width is going to be 1, which is really small for us right now. So we are then going to give this a border. So we can say something like border L2, which means that there is going to be a border at the left. We also need to give this a margin of auto, so we can see this in the center. Now you see it's center. And now we can also give the color. So we can say something like border and then indigo and then 500. So we see now this is snap point, right? One of the things that you would see that this is not 100% height. So you cannot see this going all the way from top to bottom. So what I'm going to do is that So we can say something like py10, something like this. So you see that now we got a snap point and this as well. Now we are going to essentially go to absolute element, and here we are going to give this another thing, and here we are going to give this a full height, so we can say h full, and that would make sure that we get the snap point right here. Now you would notice that this is coming essentially on top of everything, which essentially is not something that we want. So we are going to give this a z index of 0, but this doesn't work like this, and this is because you cannot just say one element being z index 0 and the others nothing. So we also need to specify the z index of 1 to the other elements as well, and we also need to give the other ones some other classes as well that I'm going to share right now. So here we are going to essentially give all these elements, or essentially I think we can just give this one. So we can say something like z index of 1, and if we do so, then we also need to give this a relative of class, and that would mean if I refresh now, you can see that now the image is above the snap point, right? And this looks okay to us. Now that we have this snap point, you would see that now when I snap, it is exactly at the center of the image, and that's why this is working perfectly fine. Now that we have this, we just need to style this guy here. Now, instead of having this text here, what I can do is that I can use some arbitrary properties to define the after content for this element that we have just created. So what we are going to do is that we are just going to say after content, and then here we can say something like snap point, and you can see that as I'm writing that, it is essentially adding all of that, right? So I can essentially just say snap here, and now we are going to give this some classes or some styles. So we are going to say after is going to have a margin left of 2, so you can see that now we have a margin. Then we are going to say the after is also going to have a padding of 1.5, and then we are going to give this a background. So we are going to say after bg indigo and 500, and now you see we got a background. Also is going to be a bit smaller and it's going to be white, so we can say after text sm, and then here we can say after, and then we can say something like text white. But instead of this text sm, we are going to give this a hard-coded value or an arbitrary value, and the value is going to be 0.625 rem, just for the sake of simplicity. And here we are also going to make this rounded, so we can say after rounded. And now this looks cool, but I want to change the px value. So maybe just change this to p2, and then maybe py of 1, something like this. And then after as well. So this essentially is applied to the py. There we go. So I can move now these elements. I can see that the images are essentially being snapped to the center, apart from the first and the last image, of course. Otherwise the scroll would be weird, but the rest of them are working fine. Now let's talk about the final thing and the fifth thing that you need to know, and that is styling form controls, or actually the file input, which is an absolute mess whenever we are building web applications and we want some sort of custom styling to the file input. So let's see how that works in Tailwind CSS version 3. So I'm going to actually put the before code here so we can start with that. And if I go down, you can see that we have this sort of style here. So we have a BG gray, we have a relative P9, here we have flex item center, but we don't have sort of the justify content center here. So we can essentially maybe say here justify center. So this is also sort of centered right now. Now, how do we style this file input so we can essentially make it look more like our own websites? So first of all, we need to potentially also style this no file chosen text, and the way to do that is just to provide some sort of classes to the file input. First of all, we can say something like text sm, and you can see that the no file chosen text is now changed. We also need to say something like text gray, and then make it, let's say 500, and now you see that the color itself is a bit different as well. And now let's talk about how do we style this guy here, the button itself. So we are going to start with saying this is file and margin right is 4. As soon as we do that, you see that it now got some space around that. Now we can also style how this button looks. So we can begin with saying file, and then we can say something like py is going to be 4. So we can begin with saying file, and here we can say px is going to be 4, but py or file py is going to be 2. So we are essentially adding a bit of padding into this particular element or the display of it. Then we are essentially going to round this. So we are going to say file rounded and full. So now you see that we got this oval shape here. Then we are going to remove the border. So we are going to say file and then something like border 0, and you see that now we don't have any sort of border. We are also going to say file text is going to be semi bold, so we have a bit of bold text, something like this. And we are also going to say file and font semi-bold. So you can see that now we have a bold text here. Then we are also going to give this a custom background. So we can say something like file, BG, violet, and maybe use 50 here, which is pretty light color. But if I remove this or add this, you see the difference, right? So 50 is going to be here. Then we are going to say file, text, and violet, and then we are going to use 700, and then we are going to also show some styles for the hover state. So I'm going to say hover, file, and then cursor pointer. So you will see that when I hover this, you can see the cursor being changed to pointer. And similarly, we are going to say something like hover, file, and then we are going to say BG, violet, and maybe use 100 here. So now if I go and change, you can see that now whenever I hover over this, you can also see that working. All right, so now you know how to actually style the native file input using Tailwind CSS. And that is it for this video. I hope that you learned a lot of things in this video, not just those 5 things I wanted to teach, but also how we style a couple of things here and there, and how the arbitrary values can also be added to this one. If you like the video, make sure to press the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. That really helps the channel grow and kind of helps push out this content to all the developers out there. I stream on every Wednesday and Saturday on YouTube and Twitch, so feel free to jump there anytime. And as always, happy coding, and I'm gonna see you in the next one.